So, segregationist and discriminatory laws affected a larger group of people and existed in a larger number of states than we might think when we think of things like Jim Crow laws. And likewise, the time period in which these sorts of laws have been repealed extends beyond the period that I'm going to be talking about in this very brief and superficial lecture. And it includes efforts on a number of different fronts. When we think about lawsuits and adjudication and interpretation of existing laws, people usually think of the first truly significant defeat for Jim Crow laws as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 347 U.S. 483. Now, this was a suit brought by the NAACP with the future first African-American Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall serving as the NAACP's lead counsel. The Supreme Court decided in favor of the NAACP in 1954. And this is a very famous case that had a significant impact in the United States. However, there were other earlier victories as well. For instance, Buchanan versus Wardley, 245 U.S. 60, which was decided in 1917, went some ways towards mitigating laws that created residential segregation. Irene Morgan versus Virginia, decided in 1946, placed some restrictions on laws that sought to segregate interstate transportation. Outside of the legal realm, acts of civil disobedience, such as the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, the 1961 Albany, Georgia movement, which ended in the 3-day jailing of Martin Luther King, as well as the 1965 Selma to Montgomery marches, which of course ended in the infamous Bloody Sunday battle on the bridge. All of these acts of civil disobedience worked an equally important side of the efforts to create laws that would prohibit discriminatory and segregationist legislation. So Brown versus Board of Education triggered a series of civil rights acts, beginning with the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The 1957 Act focused primarily on voting rights and wasn't particularly successful at rolling back the various Jim Crow measures to prevent voting. The Second Civil Rights Act passed in 1960. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 sought to address other manifestations of discrimination, such as desegregation in schools. It also introduced a number of mechanisms for the enforcement of these kinds of laws and stepped up the fines for violations. However, a more comprehensive end to Jim Crow sorts of laws didn't come about until the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act utilized the federal right to regulate interstate commerce, which is Article 1 of the Constitution, to outlaw discrimination in use and access to public places. It also forbade discrimination in access and use of public facilities by state and local governments. The Voting Rights Act addressed the deficiencies of the 57, 60, and 64 Civil Rights Acts with regard to voting. It forbade federal, state, and local governments from imposing, to quote the law, voting qualification or prerequisite to voting, or standing, practice, or procedure to deny or abridge the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. In addition to closing many of the loopholes, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act created a mandate in the Department of Justice to monitor the voting practices and laws in states that showed a consistent record of discrimination and segregation. And that monitoring lasted intact until just a few years ago, actually. And as I say, 1965 didn't mark the end of discriminatory and segregatory laws. It didn't result in equal civil rights for all people of all ages, races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, genders, and so on. Other battles for civil rights continued on and continue on to this day. This does give us a good sense of how it is that civil rights come about, how it is that they can be enforced or worked around,